United States of America has proposed a Russian Sanctions Act of 2025, where any country buying oil or petroleum from Russia would be charged with 500% of tariffs by the United States of America.
A 500% tariff on Russian oil will stop the Indians and the Chinese buying it.
500% tariffs on anybody who buys his oil or gas or petrochemicals. 500% tariff on India, on China.
We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil. We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian LNG. We are not the country which has the biggest trade surge with Russia after 2022.
Just like India and Pakistan, we're going to end up in a nuclear war if I didn't stop them. You know, it's sort of strange. I saw they were fighting. Then I saw 7 jets were shot down.
Hypocrisy ki bhi seema hoti hai.
It is kind of a secondary sanction which is being used by United States of America against any country which might trade or which might buy crude oil or petroleum from Russia. And it is very important for us to know that India has sharply criticized this move of United States of America.
We are a country where actually the Americans said for the last few years that we should do everything to stabilize the world energy markets, including buying oil from Russia.
And they've also called down the double standards of the Western media and the Western world, whereby European Union is okay in buying the gas from Russia, buying the crude oil from Russia, or indirectly purchasing lower priced crude oil from Russia. But when India, China, or Brazil, or some other nations, they deal with Russia in relation to the crude oil, they have a problem.
You know, Europe imported in the same period 6 times the energy, which India did. Essentially, if it is a matter of principle, why didn't Europe cut on the first day? Why didn't we see on 25th of February a complete cutoff of energy imports from Russia? You can't say it's my principle, but by the way, I will do it by my timing.
So what is the geopolitics around this issue? What is the stance of India in this regard? And what are the reasons which is why we are importing from Russia and why US doesn't want India to import crude oil from Russia? All the things we'll be trying to understand in this particular session. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh and you're watching Perspective. Now let's make it very, very clear. India is an import-dependent country when it comes to petroleum and crude oil. Now, second thing is, India imports 85% of petroleum requirements from outside, which means it is a net importer in relation to petroleum-based products. Now, while this is the case, India needs to maintain good relationship with the country from which it imports crude oil. And the largest country, the first country from which imports the crude oil is that of Russia. Now, it was not the case 5 to 6 years back, but in the last 5 to 6 years, Russia has emerged as a major power, has emerged as a major partner for us in relation to the trade of crude oil and petroleum. The second in this list is Iraq, and the third in this list is Saudi Arabia, and then eventually United Arab Emirates. Now, to make you understand with the help of a data, let's take the financial year 2022. Now, in the financial year 2022, Russia used to account just for 2.1% of India's oil imports. So, of the entire oil imports which India used to do, from Russia, we used to only import 2.1% of our total imports. This is the year 2022. By the year 2025, this percentage has jumped to 35.1%. Now, by this year, 2025, India is importing more than 30%, that is around 35% of its oil requirements from Russia, making Russia the top supplier for our country, even ahead of the West Asian nations, whether it be UAE or whether it be Qatar or Saudi. Also, one more data from the year 2021 suggests that in that year, India used to import only 0.1 million barrels a day from Russia. But this number multiplied into number of times, and by the year 2024, which means in a matter of 3 years from 21 to 2024, India started importing 1.9 million barrels a day from Russia. From 0.1 million barrels to 1.9 million barrels a day, India and Russia's partnership in relation to crude oil and petroleum has gone a long way. Now, you might ask the question why. See, the simple reason is that after the Russia-Ukraine war, Western nations put a lot of sanctions on Russia, which is why Russian economy was about to be crippled.
Western countries are imposing sanctions on Russia following the country's move to recognize 2 separatist regions in Ukraine.
The United States as well as the European Union have both targeted the Russian financial sector, but no crushing sanctions on Russia's energy sector have been announced.
Now, US, Canada, European Union, Germany, Britain and Japan have imposed these sanctions against Russia.
I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions.
These sanctions are a major step.
And we hold further sanctions at readiness to be deployed.
At that time, Russia started distributing and selling its crude oil, its petroleum at discounted rates, at discounted levels. Now, when they started this discount, India started buying crude oil from Russia at these massive discounts. Also, one more data you'll be shocked to know of is that from 2022 to 2024, India imported discounted crude oil from Russia and saved around 13 billion US dollars. Now, these 13 billion US dollars could have been used for much more other purposes and eventually for building our economy. So, this simply shows that at geopolitical level, at economic level, importing oil from Russia is at the best interests of our country. This is how diplomatic games are played. This is how geopolitics is played. India needs to keep their own interest at the forefront at all times. Only then the negotiation table would be open, if India's interests would be talked about. Now, while this particular news is doing the rounds, North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO has also warned countries like India, China and Brazil to stop buying Russian oil from Russia or they will face 100% secondary sanctions.
President of China or the Prime Minister of India or the President of Brazil, I will slam secondary sanctions on you of 100%.
So while this Russian Sanctions Act of 2025 is being passed, alongside this, NATO is also giving warning to these countries, especially India. However, as you would know, India won't bow down because of these small pressures. India has accused the West of double standards.
Europe has managed to reduce its imports while doing it in a manner in which it is comfortable for Europe.
However, one more question here is that what do you mean by secondary sanctions? See, secondary sanctions are the penalties which are levied on a third country, which means it is a penalty which don't directly target the country or the entity which is violating international norms, but it instead punishes the third party for indulging with the other party. So, for example, it is targeted over countries, companies, individuals who are having any businesses or maintaining relationship between the primary targets of the individual. Now, for example, US has imposed multiple restrictions and sanctions on Russia. Now, in this case, Russia becomes the primary sanctions target. Also, US would also say that if India in future does any trade with Russia, India would also be sanctioned by US. Now, this is what we call as a secondary sanction, whereby India, being the third party doing business with the primary sanctions target, is also suspected to certain sanctions, is also susceptible for certain sanctions. Now, the problem with secondary sanctions is that it in a way restricts the sovereignty of the countries, and it in a way tries to put pressure to some other countries which are not actually involved in the conflict. Also, one important thing to note here is that these secondary sanctions, they can lead to severity of diplomatic ties, which means they can strain diplomatic ties, especially in the times when the third party is an ally of the country. For example, US and India are good friends. They have signed several agreements together, and in a lot of different areas, they're working mutually together. Now, in this case, while India and US are good friends, if India interacts with Russia and buys crude oil from Russia, US have to impose a sanction on India as well. Because in this case, India becomes the third party sanction. So in this case, India becomes the third party who is being sanctioned. This is the entire story of secondary sanctioning and what the current story is all about. So which is why India has clearly opposed this Russian Sanctions Act and also the NATO's tariff threats. The question which you might ask is why? The first reason is energy security of our country, which I've already told you that 85% of the energy source we import, or the petroleum sources we import. So one is in relation to energy security. Second is in relation to the double standard shown by the West. Now, India has pointed out multiple times that several European countries, they still buy Russian energy, and they have a very long project as well where Russian energy would be transferred to European regions. Also, to give you the data, in the year 2024, European Union, it imported 18% of its natural gas from Russia. So which simply means that if India does it, India is bad, India is wrong. If European Union does it, they are doing it because of the necessity, or they are doing it just because of some other motive.
We have reduced already massively the gas supply from Russia. So what we do now, we put sanctions out and we want to put tariffs on oil supplies that are still coming to the European Union.
Also, one more thing why we oppose this is because India sees this as a negotiation tactic, which has been multiple times used by US to come to the negotiation table and come up with some points in which they are more powerful than the other party. So which is why India has also thought of it in this way, and which is why we have confronted US and we have said no to these particular sanctions. Now, the real question in front of us is that if such a question arises or such a question comes, where US imposes sanctions on India, secondary sanctions on India, while doing so, NATO also gives the threat of tariffs tariffs being put on India, that is also done, let's say. In that case, what should India do? How should India navigate? See, the first thing which is very clear in our mind, or which must be very clear in our mind, is that India needs to diversify. India needs to have multiple sources for oil, for petroleum, and for natural gas, which is why diversification of energy imports is the key. So first strategy is very clearly the diversification of energy imports of India. Now, India currently is sourcing crude oil from 40 different nations, up from earlier 27 countries. And India is also importing from countries like US and Brazil as well. All the while India is increasing its shipment from Saudi, from Iraq, from African nations, or other countries as well. It has been helping India to reduce its dependence on Russia. Also, one more suggestion is given that India needs to be more proactive, more vigilant in organizations like Quad, in organizations like BRIC, ASEAN, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or BIMSTEC, for energy reliance and for energy exploration. Different other ways and means needs to be explored for formation of energy in the country, and which is why India needs to use these multilateral global platforms, including your G20, including strategy dialogues like 2+2 meetings between India and US, or India and European, and different other areas as well. What needs to be done is research and discussion. But research and discussion won't suffice. We need to practically implement the research and discussion as well, which is why we can also build, or we should, and we actually are building, strategic oil reserves. So we need to accelerate the expansion of India's strategic petroleum reserves to act as a buffer during global supply chain disruptions. We need to increase investments in the domestic energy companies, domestic oil and gas fields, whether it be through public support, whether it be through policy support, or through public-private partnership as well. Basically, we need to ramp up three things. One is ethanol blending, second is biofuel, and third is hydrogen production, in order to reduce the crude oil reliance in the country, in the state. Now, while we have already started discussing about this issue, there was one more term which was very popular a few years back, when the Russia-Ukraine war just started. The term was laundromat. Now, laundromat was a term which was used for several countries by Western and European media. For example, countries like India, Brazil, China. For these countries, this term was used in Western media. The term was laundromat. Now, what that term meant was, these Western countries or Western medias were portraying is that India as a country is doing a very smart thing. India buys cheap crude oil from Russia. They process the crude oil, and after processing the crude oil, then the processed crude oil is sent to European Union markets. Now, while this is done, India actually imports the crude oil, does some value addition, and then sells the product in the European Union as it is made in India, or as it is refined in India, and because of which the sanctions which have been levied on Russia by USA stands nullified. Because several countries in European Union, because they can't buy directly from Russia, they are buying through a route which comes from India. And India is acting as a laundromat, like how laundry would act, or how money laundering acts, where black money is converted into white money. So in similar case, a commodity which is usually sanctioned, and a country can't buy that commodity from some other country, you act as an intermediary, you buy the commodity from the other party, you do some value addition, and then you sell the commodity to the other party. This is how a laundromat would work. And according to the allegations put forward by Western media, India, China, Brazil, and different other nations were acting as laundromats during the Russia-Ukraine war, or aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, when the prices of crude oil simply slashed it down significantly. Now, one thing which you might feel is that why US is so angry on Russia. See, one simple reason is that Russia, because of the suspicion of Ukraine might joining NATO, attacked Ukraine. Now, this definitely doesn't go very well with US, and US has been supporting and funding alongside European Union the war between Russia and Ukraine. And they have been funding Ukraine side of the war. Now, while that thing was going on, let's see how the distribution pattern, or how the buying pattern of India with other importing nations, other exporting, crude oil exporting nations have changed. So let's take the year 2021-2022. In that particular year, only 2.10% of crude oil was imported by India from Russia. Only 2.10%. And by the year 2024-2025, it has come back to 35.10%. Which means 35% of the crude oil we are getting from here. Now, also, if you see the year 2024-2025, 35% of the crude oil we are getting from Russia, which means that in the year 2021-2022, only 2.1%. And in the span of 3 years, it is 35.1% from one single country. However, the tragic thing is that from Iraq, earlier we were importing in the same year, 2021-2022. In that same year, from Iraq, India was importing around 24.5% of the crude oil. But in 2024-2025, India imported just 19.1% of the crude oil. So which means decline of percentage of crude oil from Iraq. From Saudi also similar type of cases there, around 4% less than before we are ordering from Saudi. Same is the case with UAE, same is the case with Kuwait, and similar is the case with USA. So in the year 2021-2022, India was importing around 8.22% of its crude oil from USA. But 3 years later, 2024-2025, India just imported 4.6% of its crude oil requirement from US, which means in relation to US also, there is a fall of 4.3% with perspective to how much India is importing from US in the form of crude oil. Now, this is alone to show us that because Russia is providing discount, all the other countries who have petroleum reserves won't be happy, which is why those countries plus NATO plus US, they are aligning together in order to ensure that the effect of sanctions on Russia, they are immediate and they make the economy of the Russia cripple down. But Russia, as you know, it's having a strong economy. They have different other ways of reigniting their economy back, which is why recently when we saw the global recession taking place, Russia in a way was growing in a positive way, which is a wonderful, remarkable feat for the country. Now, while the war goes on, Russia would continue to provide cheap petroleum and discounted oil to countries like India and China. Now, India and China, because in geopolitics, what you see primarily is your own interest, which is why India, while foreseeing its own interest, needs to purchase crude oil and petroleum from Russia. Whatever other countries say, other countries are not going to give us oil and petroleum for free, or they are also not going to give us at a discounted rate. While from wherever we get at a discounted rate, why shouldn't we? We are a sovereign nation, we are an independent country, so no other country should have the courage to dictate us and tell us from where to buy the oil and petroleum and from where not to buy, which is why any such action taken by US or NATO restricting us from buying Russian oil won't go very well in maintaining our good diplomatic relationship. Definitely there would be something sour, and definitely there will be something bad in the bilateral relation of the two countries if the US goes ahead with these kind of things. Of course, eventually we should not just be relying on these exhaustible sources of energy. We need to find another source of energy. We need to make the other infrastructure very prominent, like solar energy needs to be prominent, wind energy needs to be used in order to ensure that oil and petroleum's dependence reduces to the maximum. I hope you gained a new perspective from the session. Do let me know what are your views surrounding this action being taken by US against India, against other countries in the form of secondary sanctions. I'll be very happy to know your comments and your views surrounding it. All the very best. Have a beautiful day. Thank you.